The colonel's hand stopped halfway through a handshake when he saw the patch on my jacket. Not my rank, not my face. The patch. It was small, maybe 2 inches across, olive drab background with a faded emblem I'd sewn on without knowing what it meant. I'd found it in a coffee can in my grandfather's garage, wrapped in a strip of cloth like it was something that needed to be protected. The colonel's eyes locked onto it and stayed there. The conversation around us, 20, maybe 30 people in a hotel ballroom, all there for a veteran advocacy dinner, faded into background noise. "Where did you get that?" he asked. His voice was quiet, not rude, just very, very careful. "It was my grandfather's," I said. "He passed us away in the spring." The colonel straightened. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he looked at me directly for the first time. "What was his name?" "Leonard Pruitt," I said. Something shifted in the colonel's expression. Not surprise exactly. More like recognition landing somewhere he hadn't expected it to land. "We need to speak privately," he said. "Please." That was the moment I understood that the man my mother had spent 20 years calling a disappointment might have been something else entirely. My grandfather lived alone in a small house outside Beckley, West Virginia, the kind of town that apologizes for itself in the winter. Bare hills, gray skies, dollar stores where the 5 and dimes used to be. His house had a covered porch he never used and a backyard garden he tended obsessively, tomatoes and green beans mostly, sometimes peppers. He drove a truck with 200,000 miles on it and refused to replace it. He paid his bills in cash when he could and had a distrust of paperwork that my mother found infuriating. "He makes everything harder than it has to be," she used to say. "Always has." My mother grew up resenting him. She didn't talk about it much, but when she did, the picture that emerged was of a father who was absent even when he was present, who listened politely and then changed the subject, who showed up to her high school graduation in a suit that didn't fit and left early without explaining why, who never talked about work, about the army, about anything that happened before she was 10 years old. He had secrets, she told me once, not interesting ones, just his way of keeping distance. I never saw it that way. Maybe because I was the grandchild, which is a different relationship. There's less expectation in it, less history. When I was growing up, I spent summers with him while my parents worked. We gardened, we drove to the library. He taught me to identify birds by their calls, which sounds like the kind of thing a gentle old man does, and it was, but there was also something focused about the way he did it, methodical, like he was teaching me to pay attention rather than just to name things. He had been in the army. I knew that much. There were old photographs in a shoebox in his closet, him in uniform, young, thin, standing in front of buildings I didn't recognize. When I asked about them as a kid, he'd smile and say, "That was a long time ago, sweetheart." When I pushed, he'd say, "Some things aren't mine to tell." I thought that was a strange thing to say. I didn't understand it until much later. He was diagnosed with congestive heart failure when I was 26. I was working as a physical therapist in Richmond by then, and I drove up the first weekend after he called to tell me. He didn't call my mother first. He called me. "Don't make a fuss," he said when I arrived. "I just wanted you to know." I stayed for 3 days. He was thinner than I remembered, moving more slowly, but he was still tending the garden, still making coffee at 5 in the morning, still watching the birds at the feeder through the kitchen window. I asked him if he needed anything. "Company sometimes," he said, "but only when you have it to spare." My mother's reaction when I told her was complicated. She sighed. She said she'd try to visit. She didn't, not for 2 months, and then it was a single afternoon visit that ended with her frustrated because he wouldn't agree to move closer to her. "He's always like this," she said on the phone afterward. "He won't let anyone help him." "He's not refusing help," I told her. "He just doesn't want to be managed." She didn't see a difference. He declined slowly through that fall and into winter. I drove up every few weeks. My mother came twice more. My aunt, her older sister, sent a fruit basket. My uncle texted that he was praying for him. He died in February on a Tuesday in his own bed. His neighbor, a retired school teacher named Mrs. Holloway who had been checking on him daily, was the one who found him and called 911. She was also the one who called me, because he had left my number on a card on the kitchen counter labeled "In case of emergency," with my name and my cell phone number written in his careful handwriting. I drove 4 hours in freezing rain to get there. My mother arrived the next evening. She stood in his living room looking at the stacks of books and the bird guides and the photographs and said quietly, "I never knew what to do with him." I thought about saying something. I didn't. The funeral was small. a graveside service with a borrowed pastor who had never met him, an honor guard from the local VFW post that showed up without being asked because someone from the post had known his name, and 7 people counting me. My mother, my aunt, Mrs. Holloway, a man in his 80s who introduced himself only as someone who had served with my grandfather a long time ago and who shook my hand and looked at me for a long moment without saying anything else. My mother cried, "I'll give her that." She cried quietly and stood very straight and didn't say anything cruel. That's not nothing. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Old clothes, tools, a record player and a collection of albums he never told me he had. Paperback westerns stacked 3 deep on every shelf. In the kitchen drawer, a folder with his discharge papers, a copy of his will leaving everything to me and my mother in equal shares, and a property tax receipt from 1987. At the back of his closet, behind a row of hanging flannel shirts, was a metal ammunition can. Army surplus, olive drab, latched but not locked. Inside were the things he had decided mattered. A stack of letters held with a rubber band, a photograph of 2 young men in civilian clothes standing in front of what looked like an Eastern European city, a small notebook with a red cover, and the patch. The patch was sitting on top of everything else, like it was meant to be found first. It was military insignia, but nothing I recognized. Not a standard unit patch. The emblem was unusual, a detail I won't describe specifically because the colonel later asked me not to, but distinct enough that I knew it wasn't decorative. It looked functional. It looked like something that meant something to someone specific. I sewed it onto an old field jacket that had been my grandfather's, not as a costume, just because it felt wrong to leave it in a can. I wore that jacket to the veteran advocacy dinner 3 months later, the one my friend had invited me to, the one where I didn't know anyone and stood near the bar feeling slightly out of place. The one where the colonel stopped mid-sentence when he saw what was on my sleeve. His name was Colonel Aldridge, retired. He'd driven 2 hours to the dinner, he told me, which he said later was more than coincidence. He'd seen the event listed in a newsletter and decided, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, that he should attend. He took me to a quieter corner of the ballroom, near a window with a view of the hotel parking lot. It wasn't dramatic. There were people 10 feet away talking about appropriations and health care for veterans, but the space felt private enough. Your grandfather's, Leonard Pruitt, Sergeant. Is that right? I said yes. I didn't know his rank exactly, but yes. He listed sergeant on his discharge papers, the colonel said. That was intentional. I didn't understand. I said so. His actual designation was different, the colonel said. He paused for a moment, looking at the patch on my sleeve. There are units in the Army that don't appear in official records. Not then, not now. Your grandfather was part of one of those units for approximately 11 years. I said, 11 years? His service record shows 2 years of active duty and a routine discharge, the colonel said. That's what he was authorized to present if anyone asked. The rest is what didn't happen officially. I looked at the patch. What does it mean? I asked. It identifies personnel assigned to a specific operational classification, he said. Not rank, not unit exactly. More like clearance for a category of work. Work that required complete deniability. I thought about my grandfather's answer when I was 12 and asked why he never talked about the Army. Some things aren't mine to tell. I had thought it was deflection. I had thought he was being private. But that wasn't it at all. They were never his to tell because they had never officially happened. I called my mother that night from the hotel parking lot. Did Grandpa ever tell you anything about what he did in the Army? I asked. She exhaled slowly. He was in for 2 or Signal Corps, I think. Something administrative. He never made it sound important. He wasn't Signal Corps, I said. What do you mean? A colonel at a veteran event recognized the patch from his things. He said Grandpa was part of something classified, something that lasted 11 years. There was a long pause. Sweetie, she said finally, your grandfather was not a spy. I didn't say spy. He drove a 2003 pickup truck and grew tomatoes, she said. He forgot to call me on my birthday twice. He was not living a secret life. I thought about how to respond to that. I thought about the photograph of 2 men in civilian clothes in a European city with no caption and no date. I thought about the notebook with the red cover that I had looked through and understood almost none of, numbers and letter codes and dates spanning almost a decade. I thought about the man at the funeral who shook my hand and looked at me like he was measuring something. I'm going to look into it, I said. She sighed. Don't turn this into something it isn't. I hung up and sat in my car for a while. The field jacket was on the seat beside me. I picked up the patch and looked at it in the overhead light. My grandfather had placed it on top of everything else in that ammunition can. He'd wanted it found. He'd wanted someone to find it who would know what to do with it. And since he couldn't know who that would be, he'd put it somewhere only someone who cared enough to look through his things would find it. He'd been waiting for someone to ask the question. I just hadn't known the question existed. I did not go through official channels. I'd done enough reading to know that official channels, for the kind of thing the colonel was describing, produce official non-answers. Instead, I called a woman I'd worked with briefly at a VA clinic, someone who'd spent 20 years in Army intelligence before retiring to civilian healthcare. I described the patch without telling her where I'd gotten it. She went quiet in a way that felt familiar. "That's not something you see every day," she said. "What is it? Where did you come across it?" I told her. Another silence, longer this time. "I need you to understand something," she said finally. "There were programs. I can't tell you which ones because I don't know which one specifically this relates to. But there were programs where the personnel involved were completely separated from their service records. Separated on paper, I mean. Their families were told they'd completed their service. In some cases, the families believed it because they were given every reason to. He was there for 11 years, I said. His own daughter thought he did 2 years. That tracks, she said. What was he doing? I don't know, she said. And even if I did, I wouldn't be able to tell you, not because I'm protecting anything, but because the records for programs like that either don't exist anymore or are still restricted. Then how do I find out? She thought for a moment. The colonel who recognized the patch, she said. How old is he? I told her. Then he was in during the right period, she said. He's not going to be able to give you documentation, but he might be willing to give you more than you have now. I called Colonel Aldridge the next morning. He answered on the second ring. We met at a coffee shop near his home in southwestern Virginia, a small place with wood paneling and a case of pastries that nobody seemed to be buying. He was already there when I arrived. He had brought a thin envelope which he set on the table between us without opening it. I've been thinking about whether to show you this since last night, he said. I sat down. Your grandfather saved my life, he said. I don't say that loosely. I mean it literally. In the winter of 1987, in a situation I cannot describe with any specificity, I would have died without his intervention. And he never told anyone. Not because he was modest, because he was not supposed to have been there. I felt something press against the inside of my chest. He wasn't supposed to have been there, I repeated. Officially, no one was, the colonel said. That was the entire point. The people your grandfather was working with, and I'm using that word carefully, needed things done that could not be attributed to the U.S. government. If it worked, nothing had happened. If it failed, nothing had happened. And if someone got hurt? He looked at me steadily. Nothing had happened. I thought about the letters in the ammunition can, still rubber-banded, still unread because I hadn't let myself read them yet. I thought about the years my mother spent thinking he was just distant, just difficult, just a man who couldn't connect with his family. She hadn't been entirely wrong. He had been distant. He had been unable to close the gap between what he knew and what he was allowed to say. That gap was real, and it had cost him, and it had cost her, and she didn't have the information she would have needed to forgive him for it. Why didn't he tell her? I asked. Even after, even when it was over. She was his daughter. The colonel was quiet for a moment. Some men, he said carefully, convince themselves that the silence is protection, that if they don't speak about it, the people they love can't be touched by it. And after long enough, the silence becomes the only fluent language they have left. He paused. I'm not saying it was right. I'm saying it was what he knew how to do. He opened the envelope. Inside were 2 sheets of paper, clearly photocopied from something older, with significant portions blacked out. But enough remained. A list of personnel identifiers, not names, but the kind of letter number codes that stand in for names in documents that are never meant to be read. One of them had a small annotation in the margin, handwritten, that said simply, Pruitt, reliable. This is from a debrief document, the colonel said. The original is still restricted, but this copy was shared with me years ago by someone who thought it was important that a few people knew. Off the record. He looked at me. I'm passing it to you for the same reason. I stared at the word, reliable. That was my grandfather. That was the whole of it. A man who spent 11 years being reliable in ways that could never be verified or celebrated or even acknowledged, and then spent the rest of his life being called difficult by a daughter who had no idea what had been asked of him. I took the paper carefully and folded it. "Thank you," I said. "He asked about you once," the colonel said. I looked up. "Years ago, after he was out. We crossed paths at a veteran event, actually. Not unlike last night." He almost smiled. He said he had a granddaughter who was going into physical therapy. He said she paid attention. He paused. He seemed very proud of that, the paying attention part. I didn't trust myself to speak for a moment. "He never told me any of this," I finally said. "No," the colonel said. "But he kept the patch." I went home to my mother's house that weekend. We sat at the kitchen table with coffee that neither of us was drinking. I put the photocopied page on the table, and the photograph from the ammunition can and the red notebook. I put the patch beside them. She looked at the items for a long time without touching them. "This is his handwriting," she said finally about the notebook. "Yes." She picked it up, turned it over. "Set it down." "I don't understand most of this, neither do I, but the colonel does, and he confirmed what it is." She looked at the photograph, the two young men in civilian clothes, European backdrop, no date. "Is he in this?" I pointed to the one on the left. She leaned in, studied his face. He looked so young. He was probably in his early 30s. She sat back. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the neighbor's dog was barking at something. A car passed on the street. "He was doing this," she said slowly, "when I was in middle school, yes, and I thought." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I thought he just didn't care enough to be present, that he preferred his distance, that he found excuses to be somewhere else. He wasn't making excuses, I know that now." Her voice was very flat, not angry, something past angry, more like something that had calcified. "But I spent 30 years believing he chose not to be there, that I wasn't worth being there for. That's..." She stopped again. "I know," I said. "That's a lot of years to feel like you weren't worth your father's time." I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything right to say. We sat there for a while. My mother picked up the photograph again and looked at it for a long time, at the young man who would become the grandfather I loved and the father she had struggled to understand. "He tried," she said finally quietly. "In the ways he could, he really did try." She set it down. "I just didn't know what I was looking at." We held a second service in May, when the weather had warmed enough for his garden to be coming back. Just a small gathering, backyard of his house before the new owners took over, standing in the rows of tomato plants he'd spent 40 years tending. The colonel came. Mrs. Holloway came, the man from the funeral who had served with him came, and this time he stayed long enough to tell stories. Not classified ones, just small ones, the kind that fill in the shape of a person. How my grandfather had insisted on learning the local language wherever he was sent, even poorly, even badly, because he said you couldn't understand a place from the outside of its words. How he had a habit of arriving early and leaving before the thank yous started. How he had sent a card every December to a list of people the man didn't know, but that my grandfather said were people he owed something to. My mother listened to all of it without looking away. My uncle, who had texted his prayers and done nothing else, did not come. My aunt came and stood quietly at the edge of the gathering and cried in a way that seemed genuine. At the end, my mother stood beside the tallest tomato cage and said, to no one in particular, "I wish he'd let me try harder." I thought that was the right thing to say. Not a defense of herself. Not an accusation against him. Just the plain shape of the regret. "I still have the patch. I don't wear it in public anymore." The colonel asked me not to gently, and I understood why. "But I have it in the ammunition can on my desk where I can see it." I also finally read the letters. They were from people whose names I don't know. Short notes, most of them. A few longer, written in different decades, some on paper so old it had started to yellow, some clearly recent. All of them said versions of the same thing. Thank you, for something specific, always. For a specific night in a specific place. For a choice made under specific circumstances. The details were vague enough that I couldn't reconstruct the events, but the gratitude was precise in the way gratitude is when it comes from someone who knows exactly what they're thanking you for. One letter was dated 3 years before his death. It said, "I have never been able to tell my children why I'm alive. You are part of the reason. I hope someone someday tells yours." I read that one twice, then I read it to my mother over the phone. "He never showed me these," she said. "He kept them," I said. "He kept all of them, in the same place as the patch." Another silence. "He knew someone would find them," she said slowly. "I think he hoped someone would." My mother exhaled slowly. "You know what I keep thinking about?" she said. "He used to send me birthday cards. Every year, even when we weren't speaking. Even when I didn't call to thank him." She paused. "I thought it was just habit. Something he did because it was expected. Maybe it was also because you were his daughter and he loved you, I said. A longer pause. Yeah, she said quietly. I'm starting to think so. The amendment can is on my desk, the patch is inside it, the letters are inside it, the red notebook and the photograph and the sheet of paper with the word reliable written in the margin, the folded photocopy from the Colonel, everything. I don't have a complete picture of my grandfather's life. I probably never will. The Colonel has told me there are things that will stay classified for another decade at minimum, and some things that will simply never be released because the people who could contextualize them are gone. What I have is partial. What I have is enough to know that the shape I thought I understood was not the actual shape. He was a man who spent 11 years being reliable in ways that left no record, who came home and grew tomatoes and drove a truck he refused to replace and watched birds from the kitchen window and answered questions about his past with some things aren't mine to tell because they genuinely weren't. Who sent his daughter birthday cards every year even when she didn't call. Who left a patch on top of a can full of his most important things so that whoever cared enough to look would find it and maybe, eventually, ask the question he could never answer himself. I am 31 years old. I work as a physical therapist. I drive 40 minutes to the Veterans Center near Beckley once a month because I told my mother I would, and then I kept going because the men and women there have things to say that deserve to be heard. I'm not doing anything extraordinary. I'm just paying attention. That's what he taught me. He never said it out loud. He taught me by being exactly who he was in every small moment I had with him. The bird calls, the garden, the library, the way he listened without interrupting, the way he noticed things and said nothing. And then, later, when you thought he'd forgotten, turned out to have remembered exactly. He paid attention his whole life, in ways he could never fully explain, to things that were never supposed to be seen. I think that's the only legacy that actually matters, not what you were recognized for, what you paid attention to when no one was watching. I put the lid back on the ammunition can and set it on my desk, where I can see it every morning, and every morning it reminds me. The quietest lives are sometimes the ones carrying the most weight. If you know someone like that, don't wait to ask them who they are.